hiking student loans, fees, and making them pay. Students have to now pay back their loans at nearly 8% interest. That's outrageous. It's almost double the Bank of England.
To be fair, that was the policy of the previous government. They've done nothing about it, but they didn't actually bring that in.
Yeah, but they've rejected all calls to end it. The disability benefit cuts, the cuts to foreign aid, even the poor, the hungry, the starving. These are not Labour policies, and it's no wonder that so many Labour voters feel alienated, and they're staying at home, they're sitting on their hands, and in some cases deciding to protest by voting for Reform or the Greens.
Do you think they will reverse it?
Well, from what we heard today, no. And I think it's like they're heading for a cliff and they just keep on pressing on the accelerator. It's madness. And Labour is set to be a one-term government. You know, in the local elections, it got, a total of 18% support? 18%. And so I've even seen some reports saying of eligible voters, the actual Labour vote was about 10%. That is shocking. It is shocking. And Labour came to power with this massive landslide based on only 34% of the vote. In other words, 66% of people voted against Labour, but Labour got a landslide majority. The electoral system is causing so much alienation among voters because they feel their vote doesn't count. And for when Starmer says he's got a mandate and a huge majority, that's a lie. It's a mandate based on a flawed, corrupt voting system. It's not what the Chartists and the suffragettes fought for. It is political corruption of the highest order, and the Tories did the same. They won landslides based on tiny percentages of the votes. The system has to change, and if Labour isn't prepared to do it, they're going to be out at the next election.
Well, Sarah Olney, I'm sure you agree with the sentiments in the last part of Peter's answer there, probably all of it. But I mean, when a government becomes unpopular and they lose seats in local council elections, they always say, yes, we've heard the message, we've listened, and then do nothing different. Is that going to happen here?
Well, I really hope they do reverse their policy on winter fuel payments. I had a lady come into my constituency office a few months ago, and she came to me and to my team because she hadn't eaten for 3 days. She was absolutely desperate. There'd been an error in calculating her pension credit, which meant that she no longer qualified for pension credit, and so therefore she had also lost her winter fuel allowance. She was suddenly losing an awful lot of money in one go, and she simply couldn't afford her bills. And this is the real world impact of the kind of cuts that Rachel Reeves has put through. And I think, for her, it's kind of like making the numbers balance on her spreadsheet, but this is the impact it actually has on real people. And I think what we saw last week, very much what Peter was saying there, probably wouldn't use quite the same sort of language, but I agree broadly with the sentiment. The sort of people who vote Labour expect Labour to deliver for them, and they're simply not seeing that. And I think the winter fuel payment cut has become emblematic of the sorts of things that people hoped would get better with a Labour government and yet are getting worse. And as I say, I'm seeing that impact in my own constituency.
Laura Farris.
Well, I don't think that there's anything wrong in principle with means testing welfare payments like the winter fuel allowance. But what seemed particularly brutal about the way that Labour did it is they chose the cut-off point to be the threshold for being eligible for pension credits, which is an annual income of £11,500 a year. And I don't think any of your listeners would think that that was a significant amount of money to live on and not think that those people deserve the £300.
To be fair, this was a policy that many Conservative MPs agree with the sentiment. But where would you have put the cut-off point?
I think a suitable cut-off point actually would be that all basic rate taxpayers still received some form of winter fuel allowance. Again, it has the advantage of simplicity. It takes people into the 20,000s, and I think you would have had far less noise about that if you had chosen that. But I want to agree that I do accept, look, not all pensioners are poor. Some are, in fact, have been very fortunate. They've lived in houses that have gained considerable value, and I actually believe strongly in intergenerational fairness. So I think it's reasonable that wealthier pensioners don't pay it. But the second part of your question, Iain, it really is, what does these call from Labour MPs? What do they mean? And actually, it isn't really about one policy or another policy. This is what happens to any government when you have a poor showing at the locals. You have a cacophony of voices all saying different things and pulling in different directions. And the challenge for the leadership is to decide where they're going to hold firm and where they think they can give ground. And there will, whether it's the sort of blue Labour impulse to drive further towards the reform voter, or perhaps the more traditional Labour voice who says we should reverse all the welfare choices we've made. And that's going to be a challenge, I think, for Keir Starmer.
Andy Preston.
You know what? I mean, I think most of us in the country are on the same page here. I think every single person wants to see vulnerable people looked after, especially older people in the depths of winter when it's freezing. So, of course, we all support the idea of the payment. But none of us want to see people who don't need the money receiving benefits at the taxpayer's expense. And somewhere in the middle, there's a trade-off, isn't there? I think that if Labour had said that and explained it well and come up with the right balance, everybody would have applauded. But instead, they made an absolute pig's ear of the thing based on the fact they didn't have a plan. They came in, said some stupid things, and then scrabbled around to try and find bits of money. So I personally think
their reasoning was that, it was far more difficult than they ever thought it would be. When they saw the books, they were far worse, which David Cameron said in 2010. Which
everyone says that.
Every
your
new Prime Minister
says that. Who did this? Oh, it's much worse than
that's their explanation, to be fair to.
Yeah. Look, I think Labour came in without a plan. I think the sentiment is right, but the level is wrong. It's a political nightmare for them. Actually, if they change it, isn't most of the damage done anyway? And if they change it, I don't know. It's not a lot of money. It's 0.1% of all spending. If they could halve that, it doesn't make a lot of difference. They can do it, but I'm not sure what good it will do. Personally, I would support increasing the level of income that you can have before losing the payment. My mother is not wealthy, but she doesn't need that money, but she was getting it. And that's not right.
I mean, in the end, this comes back to that trite old cliche, well, to govern is to choose. And you've only got a limited amount. OK, you can increase borrowing, but I think we can all agree borrowing is probably roughly at its limits. So therefore, you have a finite amount of money, and you have to choose where it goes. And that was a problem your government had as well, wasn't it? It's not unique to Labour.
No, I agree with that. And I think one of the things that all governments really struggle with is being completely honest with the British people about the trade-offs that are required to deliver the kinds of services that they want, and often the lower taxes that they'd like to have. And we're not honest enough about things like the long-term sustainability of the triple lock, and we're not honest enough about, frankly, the fact that I used to be a minister in the Ministry of Justice. And our annual budget for the year at that time was £14 billion. 14 billion is the same amount that the DWP spent in a fortnight when I left government. And by the end of this parliament, it's the amount it's projected to spend in 8 days. That's the entire justice budget. That's all the prisons in this country, the probation service, the courts, all the court staff, everything. So we're not honest enough about the fact that that is not sustainable, not with all the other things that people want to do, and that cutting that involves difficult trade-offs. And I think because we don't take people with us and actually confront them with the reality, and we sort of promise too much, or politicians promise too much during election campaigns, they create a rod for their own back when they come into government and have to make the choices you've outlined.
That is true, but the Labour government has made a dogma about sticking to fiscal rules. And of course, extra borrowing is not ideal, but in the short term, if it's what gets us out of this current fix, it's worth it. This is the old model of John Maynard Keynes. You spend money to create jobs, to create money in people's pockets, which then gives a boost to business and services. That's the way to do it. That's one way. The other way is, of course, a wealth tax on people with more than £10 million in assets, which would raise a staggering £24 billion a year. 24 billion. Now, this is not a 2% tax on assets in excess of 10 million isn't going to create poverty for any multimillionaires or billionaires. It's a tiny, tiny amount. If they were true patriots and loved this country, they would willingly pay it, knowing they're contributing to the benefit of poorer people. But the government won't do it because they had more meetings with business people than they've ever had with community organisations or trade unions.
But we've already got a record number of millionaires leaving the country. That would just exacerbate it.
Hardly any millionaires are leaving the country.
No, they really are.
No, they're not. That's not true.
I think the wealth tax sounds brilliant, and if it did work like that, I do believe that Rachel Reeves, Keir Starmer, even the Tory government may have done it, but everywhere that's tried it ends up scrapping it completely or really watering it down. It just doesn't work like that, Peter. Well, it would be brilliant if it did.
The Scandinavian countries, or some of them did it, and the number of millionaires who actually left was small. There were some, that's true, but it was small. And, at the end of the day, the majority of the public, the polls show that about 3/4 of the public support a wealth tax on the very, very rich.
Of course they do. Of course they do. It means someone else is paying your bill.
We have to appeal to the conscience of the very rich. You just had a war hero in here speaking on this programme. Brilliant. During the last war, the very rich dug into their back pockets and found extra money because they knew we had a crisis, a war that was threatening our freedom and lives. We need the same appeal today to millionaires and billionaires, that if they really love this country, please help us get out of this fix, to reboot the economy and to get Britain back on track. And then if they're not willing to do it, then I think that says a really terrible thing about their own conscience and morality.
Right. We have 45 more minutes for you to put your questions to our panel, 0345 6060973. You can WhatsApp us on that number or text 84850. It's 18 minutes past 8.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale. Watch live on Global Player. This is LBC.
90 minutes past 8 on LBC. Sarah Olney is a Liberal Democrat MP. Laura Farris was a Conservative MP. What are you doing now, Laura?
I work for a communications company.
And have you found the adjustment bearable?
I have, actually. I was talking to Sarah about this beforehand because Sarah was out of Parliament for a while. I found it, it is a more relaxing life now, and I see more of my kids. And I actually found it, I have found it bearable. I really enjoy my job.
Andy Preston, former Mayor of Middlesbrough, and Peter Tatchell from the Peter Tatchell Foundation. Right, a question now from Paul in Twickenham. Paul, what would you like to ask?
Thank you, Ian. Thank you, panel. Panel, I have a suspicion that if Reform win the next election, we will eventually see migrants, asylum seekers and other undesirables housed in camps with barbed wire round those camps. Am I losing touch with my senses? Am I exaggerating? Or is there some grounds to support my suspicion?
Well, Reform UK has vowed to use what they call every instrument of power to resist housing people seeking asylum in areas where it now controls councils. That's according to its chair, Zia Youssef. Andrea Jenkins, the party's first mayor in Greater Lincolnshire, has called for migrants to be housed in tents. Sarah?
I don't think we will see camps. I don't think, regardless of last week's election results, I don't think the British people would stand for that, frankly. I think when we're, I've been out and about talking to lots of voters over the last few weeks, there's a lot of concern about the level of immigration, about the fact that the government appear to have lost control of particularly the asylum system, like the Conservative government before them. And I think that is what people are really, really concerned about. What I don't think the majority of people want to see is people being treated badly as a result. They certainly don't want to see camps in fields near where they live. They certainly don't want to see people, living in abject poverty in their parks or their green spaces near their homes. I don't think people want to see that. I think Reform have said a lot of things about what they plan to do when they're in power with their new mayoralties and the councils that they run. And I am sceptical of some of their claims. The deep crisis in funding local government is not going to be solved by firing a few diversity officers. And I think, it remains to be seen, and I'm not going to prejudge, how they get on. But we've got a lot of very, very inexperienced councillors taking on some very big jobs, running large councils, and I think it remains to be seen how well Reform are able to live up to some of their promises. But I absolutely do not think we will see migrant camps if Reform get into power. I think that would be just completely beyond the pale and entirely unacceptable.
Andy Preston.
No, I don't think we'll see barbed wire and migrant camps. I do think there are some people here who would like to see that. Not in this room, but in our country there is a significant minority who would like to see that. Look, I think we have a crisis. It's a crisis of confidence and perception in the main. And I think that so long as we have boats arriving, it does feel to many people, whether you live on the south coast or you view it from North Yorkshire, it feels like an invasion. And we have to stop that. Even if you think it's okay, so if enough people are unhappy with it, you can't tolerate it. We have to stop it. People are dying trying to cross, and the only way to do it is offshore processing. That's the only way to deter so many of these people. So why it isn't happening, I don't know. I know that we can do it if we leave the ECHR, and we have to do that. We have to save lives, save money, and reassure the public. And by the way, the asylum bill is something like £5 billion a year. For £3 to £4 billion, we can completely fix homelessness in the UK. To put that into context. So if we can halve the number of asylum seekers, have them processed offshore, we can make a massive dent in rough sleeping, kids growing up in dirty B&Bs and struggling at school. And look, I'm sympathetic to anybody fleeing persecution, but we all know that many of the people who come aren't fleeing persecution. They're young men looking for a better life. Good luck to them. We're not here. 75%
of them do get asylum. The claims take a long time to be processed.
Yeah.
But it's clear that the overwhelming majority are asylum seekers.
I think having a good story doesn't mean that you are always telling the truth. And dare I say it, if someone is found not guilty in court, they're technically not guilty, but some people who do bad stuff get off at court. So I don't think the fact that 75% are allowed and granted leave to remain, I don't think that means they are genuine asylum seekers.
What evidence do you have for that?
Based on the fact that it's always healthy young men travelling across 7, 8, 9, 10, 12 countries to get here. They are ambitious men trying to build a better life, and good luck to them, but they have to follow the rules. You cannot come here illegally.
Laura?
It is correct to say that almost 100% of small boat arrivals are undocumented, and we heard evidence in the Home Office that on the direction of the people smugglers, they abandon their personal documents in the channel. So when a decision of asylum is made, they're given the benefit of the doubt. It's not that they've shown documents that prove their status, and that is something I think the public are aware of. But to just go back to your caller's question, I think he said something like, am I confused or am I going mad? And I think that's fair, because I don't really know what Reform's policy is either. For Rupert Lowe, who was in the party and was a prominent member of the party, was talking about deportation. I've heard Nigel Farage seem to disagree with him on that. I've got no idea where they are now. I certainly agree with Sarah, actually. I don't think people want to see people living in tents, but they want the boats to stop. That message has been delivered in a way that is crystal clear, most recently last week. They want the boats to stop, and I think the only way you can do that is by having a workable deterrent. That's something that we were trying to do. We were pilloried for by the Labour Party, who abandoned it, and now small boat crossings are up by 30%.
You're talking about the Rwanda scheme?
I am, yeah.
You genuinely thought that was a deterrent?
The numbers were falling, and we didn't have the chance to implement it. I accept the criticism that's implicit in your tone.
Oh, no.
We were seeing the numbers beginning to fall, and we heard evidence from people who were going to Ireland and people in northern France that they were worried about entering the UK because of the threat of removal. Andy just talked about offshore processing. You're seeing other European countries explore third-party options. Donald Trump has said that he'll look at taking up some of the Rwanda
Just to be
accommodation.
clear, though, Rwanda
The
wasn't
idea
about
of-
offshore processing.
No,
that was
I accept
a completely
that. I
different
accept
scheme.
that.
You
It
can't
was
conflate
a
the two.
removal scheme, but the point of it was not to end up repopulating Rwanda. It was to create a deterrent that no longer made the United Kingdom an attractive
But the
option
point,
for small
my
boats.
sceptical tone, as you
Yes.
described it, really was to point out that there was only ever going to be 200 or 300 people going there a year out of, say, 40,000 arrivals. I still think if you were desperate enough to cross the channel, you would still do it, given those odds.
Well, I accept that it never got off the ground. So we're arguing on hypotheticals. But I think as a matter of principle, the idea that if you could say, if you arrive here unlawfully without documents to prove your status, we will remove you from the United Kingdom, was the beginning of the only workable deterrent that I've ever heard. And whether it was Rwanda or another third-party country, I
Peter.
haven't heard anything.
We need a major rethink of asylum policy. It's not working. The safe legal routes for genuine refugees have been virtually closed. The main way people get here now is illegally because the safe routes have been closed. That's nonsense. That's absurd. What I would suggest is that Britain needs to negotiate with France to set up asylum centres, assessment centres in Calais and other French ports where people can be assessed there in France. And those who are found to have a genuine fear of persecution, they should be allowed in legally and lawfully.
And safely.
Safely. And those who are not, if they try to cross the channel in small boats, they should be sent straight back to France. The other big reform we need is, I get people's anger about the millions that are being spent on asylum hostels and hotels. That's a real, genuine grievance. But there's a solution. The government will not allow an asylum applicant to work while his or her claim is being processed, which can take months or even years. And all that time, they are dependent on state benefits and government-provided accommodation. Those refugees, in nearly all cases, want to work, and many of them have the skills that we need. So letting refugee applicants apply while their application is being considered, that would enable them to get a job, pay for their own accommodation, their own food. It would save billions for the taxpayer, and yet governments successively refuse to do it. And moreover, having them in a job would be easier to keep track of them. Whereas if they're not in a job, they can disappear. In a job, they're easier to track and keep tabs on. So
Laura, you're a lawyer. Why don't we do that?
Well, I think the reason why we don't allow people to work while their claims are being adjudicated is simply because it would create another magnet across the channel that they could come and work. One thing I do think, actually picking up on one of Peter's points, is I think we should be thinking very seriously about digital ID cards and identification for everybody in this country, because I do think that people get lost in the system. And I know that from the asylum hotels, we had issues a few years ago, particularly actually with Albanian arrivals leaving the hotels and then subsequently being arrested and involved in sort of organised crime. And there were sort of gang operators who were very closely involved in managing the human traffic across the channel and then getting those young men into gangs and getting them working. And we managed to deal with that actually by having a very strong returns agreement with Albania. You'll recall that was what contributed to the significant drop, 12,000 people fewer between 2023 and 2022, and that was because of the Albanian returns arrangement. I think that takes me back to my original point, that if people genuinely believe that they'll be quickly returned, then they don't make the crossing in the first place.
Yeah, but genuine refugees need to be given an opportunity. I've got a guy, I've been working on asylum issues for 40 years. I'm currently helping a guy in Afghanistan. He is gay, atheist, Hazara, and was involved in the anti-Taliban resistance. 4 grounds on which he'll be executed by the Taliban if they find him. He's been on the run across towns and villages all over Afghanistan for the last 2 years. He got caught once, was imprisoned, tortured, gang raped every other day for 2 weeks before he eventually escaped. But the British government will not give him refuge in this country. They've closed the door. They said they will not give him a visa. I can provide that. I can get someone to fund his flight to Britain. He's totally genuine. I've worked with him for 2 years. I know his family and others. The British government will not give him safe passage to this country. It will not give him a visa so he can get on a flight and come to Britain. That's how corrupt and wrong immoral and unjust our asylum system is. He's genuine, he needs help and refuge, his life is in danger, yet we're shutting the door.
OK. More subjects to come on Cross Question, 0345 6060 973. It's 8:31, news headlines on LBC with Chris Barrow.
A free trade deal described as the most ambitious since Brexit between the UK and India has come under fire because of tax exemptions for some workers. The agreement makes it cheaper for British companies to employ Indian staff as they won't have to pay national insurance contributions. Mark Carney says Canada will never be for sale ever as the country's Prime Minister meets Donald Trump at the White House. The US President said a few times he'd like it to become the 51st state. The Queen has joked it would be quite tempting to take some of the ceramic poppies home, which have been installed at the Tower of London to mark VE Day. Tonight, buildings across the UK are being lit up in honour of the 80th anniversary of the end of the Second World War in Europe. LBC weather, much of the UK stays dry tonight. There's clear skies in western and southern areas, a low of 2 degrees.
This is LBC. Leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale. Alexa, send a comment to LBC.
Sarah Olney from the Lib Dems, Laura Farris from the Conservatives, Peter Tatchell from Peter Tatchell, and Andy Preston from, a multitude of parties, Andy. Now, you were an independent mayor.
Yes.
You then went Labour, and now you've gone Conservative.
No, I was Labour a long time ago. So I was right. Labour. I'm a pragmatist. So what we had a...
That's what they call it.
Yeah, shush. We had a booming global economy, and all countries were awash with cash. The tax receipts coming into Britain and other Western nations in the 90s and 2000s was monstrous. And I think Tony Blair had a great plan. He did some great work working with the most marginalised, disenfranchised and most needy people, lifting them out of poverty, which was brilliant. However, that merry-go-round has stopped. The growth is not there. The tax receipts not there. The governments are skint. They are maxed out. They cannot borrow anymore. Our welfare bill is completely out of control. And categorically, and sorry if this spoils anyone's late-night meal, we are heading to bankruptcy, as are all Western nations. Politicians are too timid and not strong enough to tell the truth, and you alluded to it earlier, Laurie. We are heading to bankruptcy. We cannot sustain 1 or 0% growth and keep spending more. And reform and what Labour did, that you can have more spending and lower tax, you categorically cannot. Something has to give. And we need politicians that tell the truth. And I think right now, the only party that is going to tell the truth is the Conservative Party.
Right.
Well, is that a good answer? That was a long answer.
Well, I was going to say, on that bombshell, let's move on to another question. It's from Jacob in Bury St Edmunds. I was going to say simple question. It's actually quite a complicated one. Is the India-UK trade deal a positive step? Now, the decision to exempt Indian workers and their employers from national insurance contributions for 3 years has upset lots of people who argue the jobs market will now be rigged against British workers. Andy, let's start with you.
OK, so I think that this is a great deal, a great business deal, a great financial deal overall, but I think it's bad politics because the headlines are going to be about the idea of preferential treatment and immigration. In truth, what this is the opposite of what Trump is doing, right? Free trade is good. Tariffs have a role in the world, but free trade is good. Free trade produces more efficiency, more productivity, more profits, which mean that governments have got the money to fix the roads, build schools and recruit more nurses. We want growth. We want frictionless trade. This is going towards that, which is very good. The misnomer that's being bandied about the preferential treatment is that if a UK company hires someone that they employ abroad, I think that for a few years, if they come here, there are lower national insurance payments. But just to be clear, people that come from India are incredibly skilled. They're incredibly hardworking. They add massive amounts to our economy. We've got a shortage of skilled workers. Did you know that we've got 68,000 Indian nurses in the NHS and over 10,000 doctors? We would be absolutely snookered without them. So if we can do a deal, grow our business, sell more stuff over there, and by the way, we win on that trade deal, not India, we win on that trade deal. This sounds like a good deal, but I'm afraid it's bad politics. It looks bad, and the media will slaughter Keir Starmer for it.
Laura?
Well, look, I don't think it's a secret that a lot of the preliminary work was done by the Conservatives. A trade deal of this magnitude takes years. And an issue that we found a sticking point, which was visas for dependents. And also on this issue, the national insurance exemption for Indian workers were issues that made it impossible for us to get it over the line for exactly the reasons that Andy's just set out, actually, because it does mean that there is then a financial advantage to hiring Indian workers just at the same time as you've hiked up the cost of employing British workers. And yet the politics of that are going to hurt Labour for sure. I mean, that is, we know that many businesses are finding those increased national insurance costs punitive, and they're affecting their growth plans and their plans for retention and for recruitment, and creating a category of worker that's exempt from that just when there is a sensitive conversation happening about immigration and numbers, I think is politically very dangerous for the government.
I suppose the counter-argument to that is that anybody who comes to this country has to pay an annual charge to use the NHS, for example,
yes,
which is all part of national insurance, I suppose. Well, or is it? I mean, it depends how you define it. But would it be unfair for people coming from India to pay that charge and then pay national insurance on the top of it?
Well, look, I think, the devil is always in the detail in these things. And the fact is the government's been quite coy about talking about the terms, and most people have only identified what the terms are by looking at the way the Indian government has talked about the deal and has talked about this exemption and so on. So I think really at this point it is going to be a matter that's closely scrutinised in Parliament tomorrow, I anticipate. But I think there will be these preliminary questions because the issue of national insurance is particularly sensitive at this point in time, and it has been a punitive tax on employers, and there's been a lot of heat on that issue specifically.
Peter?
I think the government's lack of transparency, its hesitancy, its secrecy about the full details of the deal does ring alarm bells. Maybe that will be all revealed tomorrow in Parliament, hopefully. But certainly the idea that Indian workers, valuable, skilled and talented that they are, an asset to our economy, the idea that they should be given preferential treatment in terms of national insurance, that is just playing straight into the hands of reform. And I don't understand how Labour cannot see that. They're just doing one thing after another that is boosting support for reform. It's as if Keir Starmer was a secret closet reform agent planted there years ago.
Now there's a thought.
Explains a lot.
I'm not serious, of course, but you know, it is just so stupid. You know, no political strategist with any sense would give a green light to this policy.
Sarah Olney, in any trade deal, there are things that you're going to win and there are things that you're going to lose. So that's just the nature of trade deals, I guess. Is this a price worth paying?
I don't think so. I mean, there's definitely, as you say, a lot to welcome in the trade deal. I think, in particular, it opens up new markets for Scottish whisky, for example, and that's a very important sector for us. So there's definitely a lot to welcome in the trade deal. But I think this national insurance arrangement, it risks undercutting British workers. As Laura said, employers are already facing a big hike to national insurance payments on behalf of their employees. We've got, businesses of all kinds being hammered by Trump's trade war, which, is And we don't know when we get to the end of that either, because, we're getting new announcements every day. Like yesterday was, 100% tariff on British films or something like that. So new sectors all the time are being kind of dragged into that particular drama. And it's really, it's at such a difficult time for British businesses. So to be landing something like this, I think... I think it's partly, we don't actually know what the impact is going to be. The government haven't done an impact assessment of this, or certainly they haven't shared any impact assessment that they have done. So it's going to be really difficult for businesses to actually scrutinise what this means for them, for their business, for their employees. It feels really, really rushed. And as I say, and I think as everyone has already said, it does feel particularly unwise in the current climate.
Right, 1 minute answers on this next question from Jamie, who says, Justine Greening says the Tory party is dead. Is she right? And if so, who killed it? And can it be revived? Well, the former Education Secretary wrote in The Guardian about how the Conservatives were trying to be mini-me versions of Reform UK. And unsurprisingly, she writes, Reform voters prefer the real thing. Andy Preston.
In 1 minute.
1 minute.
Okay,
that's your
so
mission.
In 10 months, we have seen Reform heading for 0 MPs to having 7 and dominating the local, forgive me, Lib Dems, but from the public's perception, dominating local politics. What has happened is incredible. Politics moves super fast, incredible things are achievable, and parties can ebb and flow faster than ever before. So writing any party off now is really stupid. But categorically, the Tories and Labour are in a tough spot because Reform haven't had power. They can promise the earth and a core of people will believe them, and they can't point to the past when they've let them down. So Reform have got a beautiful position, which they will milk, but 4 years is a long time. They could easily ebb away.
Peter.
I don't think the Tories are dead yet, but they're certainly dying. They're on life support.
They are ceasing to be.
They're on life support. And whether they can turn that around, right now it looks very doubtful because Reform is just leeching away their support. There's no...
But it's leeching away Labour's support as well, isn't it?
Oh, that's true. Yes, Labour's losing support to Reform as well, absolutely. But, I can't see any Tory senior person who can possibly have the vision, the charisma, the leadership to turn things around in the next year, 2, 3 or 4. If I was a Tory, I'd be very, very worried.
Do you think if you were a certain former Prime Minister with blonde hair, that, and I'm not talking about Margaret Thatcher, you might be thinking that a second coming might be in order?
Oh, I'm certain Boris has got a second coming up his sleeve, definitely.
Sarah?
Well, Liberal Democrats, we had a really good set of elections last week. We overtook the Conservatives. We were second place behind Reform in terms of seats won. We now control more councils across the country than the Conservatives do. And we saw time and time again in the places where we won, which are very much the places we won in our record-breaking general election last year. I know, but what I'm saying is, we're seeing increasingly people who used to vote Conservative coming to vote Liberal Democrat. My point about the general election is where we won those seats, including, I'm sorry to say, Newbury.
You're not sorry at all.
Not, only because Laura's sitting there, but otherwise I'm very pleased that the Newbury MP is now a Liberal Democrat. My point is those are the seats that we were winning. Those are the councillor seats we were winning.
Peter Tatchell.
Last week.
Honestly. Such an experienced broadcaster too.
And we won council seats there last week because people have got, like having a Liberal Democrat representative in Parliament, and they're voting for them to represent them in their local county councils as well. So, I think we're looking forward to making more gains, probably from the Conservatives.
Laura, you can have a little bit more than a minute.
Well, I don't agree with Justine Greening, and I don't think the Conservative Party is dying. I think there is a firm place for a patriotic, sensible, centre-right party in this country that applies the principles of smaller government, sound money, lower immigration, invests in the bedrocks of education and home ownership. And I know that your audience, some of them will be shouting at the radio and thinking, but you lot failed on all of that. And I accept there were failures, particularly with the leadership churn that was dreadful and humiliating, and also with some of the critical issues. And I accept that immigration was a particularly acute issue in my constituency and many others, and we've talked about it on the show. I also think that we faced one or two challenges that any government would have would have struggled with, and that includes COVID and the war in Ukraine and the subsequent impact on energy prices. People are a long way from wanting to hear apologies or kind of feel sorry for the Tories, but they were challenging issues, and I do think any government would have struggled with them. But I don't think we're just collapsing into reform. I think reform is really the Nigel Farage show, and without him they'd be nowhere. And I also think that they only really have one policy, which is an anti-immigrant policy. And I think the British people deserve a much richer and more complex policy offering than Reform has. Now, I accept that we're not in a good place. I accept that, Iain. And I accept that there's a lot of work to do. But I don't think you should conflate a moment when one of the big political parties is not in good shape with a party being dead forever.
You're going to think this is an odd question, but do you take inspiration from the Liberal Democrats? Because in 2015, they were reduced to 8 seats. And I think very few people thought that, 9 years later, they would come back with 72 seats. So a revival is possible, isn't it?
Well, that's a good point. And actually, the parable of the Liberal Democrats is one that I had not considered carefully before giving this answer. But
not seeing us as role models.
But look, I think politics is particularly volatile at the moment. Maybe in a way it never has quite been in my lifetime. You're seeing parties kind of surge and then fall back. I'm not saying that provides a complete answer to the Conservatives. I think they've got a lot of work and sort of rebuilding of trust to do. And that's something that Kemi is, working round the clock and trying to do. And I respect her so much for it, but I'm not saying that we're in a strong position, but I do think that politics is inherently changeable, and I still believe in conservative values.
Well, maybe the secret is for Kemi to emulate Ed Davey and do some of his stunts. Not sure I can see that, but you never know. It's 8:48.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
10 to 9 on LBC. At 9, we're going to return to the subject of the UK-India trade deal. Going to ask you if it really stacks up. Be really interested to hear your views on that after 9. We are with Sarah Olney, Laura Farris, Peter Tatchell and Andy Preston. And here's a text question from Sam in Exeter. How important is it that we remember the war in terms of future conflicts and to remember those like Colin Bell who fought for British freedom? Now, on Thursday, it's VE Day and the 80th anniversary of the end of the war in Europe. An LBC poll found that only 61% of the public know what VE Day is, the day Germany surrendered to the Allies in 1945. Peter, let's start with you.
Well, I was born in 1952, just 7 years after the end of the Second World War. When I was growing up, nearly all the books, films and comics were about the war. So it had a huge...
And this was in Australia?
This was in Australia. But it had a huge impact on me. I can remember as a young boy asking my parents, why didn't people stop Hitler before he got to power? Why didn't they stop him before he began the war? And no one had an answer. And it made me resolve that if I ever was in a situation where a similar dictator was in the making, that I wouldn't sit back and do nothing, that I'd try and, do something.
And you certainly lived up to that.
Well, I haven't had a Hitler.
No, but you tried to arrest Robert Mugabe. That was a good start.
Fair enough. So to me, I'm conscious all the time that we walk in freedom thanks to the sacrifice of millions of British people, both military and civilian, who are part of the war effort, and we owe them a huge, huge debt.
Sarah?
I think that's right. I mean, what we remember when we have remembrance events like the events we've had around VE Day, it's not just the events that happened, but the significance of them. And exactly as Peter was saying, we have the opportunity to live in freedom, to cast our vote in elections, to move around the country and to take up the jobs we want to take up, and be with the people we want to be with, because people fought for those freedoms, and that and in a way. What we need to remember is we need to keep fighting for them, not necessarily in that kind of direct way of, joining the army and being sent, to the front, but, just fighting for them in our everyday lives and standing up against, the things that threaten our freedom, whether it's, legislation that wants to kind of reduce our rights, or whether it's people who want to curtail our freedom of speech, or whatever it is. We just need to make sure we're not taking it for granted at any level. And I think that's why it's important, because it is 80 years now, and for people of my age, we don't have quite that same experience of having grown up in the aftermath of the war. So it's much easier to imagine that the world is the way it is and always has been like this, and exactly that, to take it for granted. And so that's why we do need to be reminded, as I say, the impact of the war as much as what individual people did.
Laura, this poll that LBC have done with More in Common today, it shows that over 2/3 of 18 to 24-year-olds don't know what happened on VE Day. They don't know what it is. Does that indicate that we need to spend a lot more time in our schools teaching kids about modern history?
I think it probably does, and I think you can feel it slipping from view. I feel like I'm part of a kind of hinge generation when, my grandparents would talk about the war in very vivid terms, but my own children only ever hear about it from me, who has no experience of it. And I think that the stakes of the Second World War and just the familiarity with losing people, seeing bombing, potentially having your country invaded, what it meant, what D-Day really meant for people living here. I think the scale of it, and as I say, the stakes have been lost somewhere. And I do think we need to explain it to people. I'm not just trying to sound like I'm kind of, critical, but that some of the things that they have, they shouldn't take for granted, because they are precious, even if they don't think about them every day.
Andy?
I think the sacrifices are what makes us who we are today, and our potential to improve and grow our economy and look after people even better. We're trying to remember, aren't we? We're trying to cling on, we're trying to educate. And there were fantastic events on Monday all over the country. But I have to say, these events have largely become fancy dress gatherings. They aren't really about the sacrifices and suffering. And there's a balance to be had between the celebration and having fun, and actually remembering the solemnity and the not just the people who died in wars, but the mothers and fathers who lost sons and daughters. But what we're discussing here is a natural part of human life. What happens is the experiences, the harrowing times of grandparents are forgotten by the grandkids, and humanity has always tried to keep those memories alive, but it's impossible because new things happen that grab attention. So we're fighting a bit of a losing battle.
I think it's one of the reasons why Russia's invasion of Ukraine has had such a massive impact in this country, because it's a current day. It's happening in real time. It's happening now. And I think for those of us who have grown up without the shadow of the Second World War, it's a realisation of what that actually means to have your country invaded, to have a foreign power move into your sovereign territory, what that must mean for people my age and younger who are now being forced to, leave the jobs and their families and go and fight, and I think that's had a massive impact on people in this country for that very reason, because we didn't anticipate that happening again.
Yeah.
And here it is, almost on our doorstep.
Can I chip in on that note, talking about Ukraine? Wasn't it fantastic to see the Ukrainian soldiers marching in the parade? What a lovely gesture.
Yeah. No, and I think that was appreciated by the crowds watching.
I think also, as much as remembering the sacrifices of Second World War, we also need to learn the lessons and go back to that question I asked my parents, why did you allow this to happen? And we've seen so many genocides since, the never again has happened, sadly, many times since
but do you
in
agree,
many different places.
Isn't the answer that you didn't get from your parents? The answer is, well, if you don't stand up to dictators, be careful what you wish for, because you can look at all the genocides that we're talking about now, well, maybe not all, but certainly some, and because we in the West, and it is generally down to the West, didn't stand up to a dictator, that has had terrible consequences for history. You look at the Rwandan genocide, where everybody washed their hands of it. And I mean, Bill Clinton, I think, now says that was his worst mistake as president. Yes. And well, I can think of a few more that he made, but that was certainly one of the more serious.
I mean, whether you call it genocide or not, what's happening in Sudan and Darfur is a modern equivalent, lesser scale, but still horrific. What's happening in Palestine and Gaza, whatever you think about the war, killing, 50,000 plus civilians, 15,000 kids, this is just absolutely monstrous. I'm totally against Hamas and always have been, but nothing can justify the extreme reaction of Israel to collectively punish the whole civilian population in Gaza. That's just not right.
Right, let's go to our fun question, which I normally warn my panel of in the break, but it wasn't ready, so I didn't. So this is as new to them as it is to you. Helen says, Australia has the democracy sausages. Stop it. Given the low turnout in the local elections, should we use snacks to get people out voting in the UK? If so, what snack would be best? Now, democracy sausages are hot dogs bought outside polling places in Australia to fundraise, not what Sarah Olney was thinking they were. You can go first, Sarah.
That is not what I thought. Yes, well, I don't know. There's very strict rules about what you can and can't do. Yes, exactly. And it's something to be really well aware of. But I think, yes, I mean, encouraging people to go and vote is a much better method than... I think Australia have compulsory voting, and I'm not in favour of that. I don't think we should introduce that, but definitely encouraging turnout, increasing the number of people who turn out to vote, who've got an engagement in the process, and I'd be happy to do that for a couple of chocolate digestives. That's all it would take for me. But
Peter?
I agree, treating people as a way of getting to the vote, it seems a very awkward and demeaning way of treating our democracy.
You get a custard cream if you give blood, so I don't see why this should be.
That's true, yeah.
I think much better to have a fair, equitable voting system where people's votes really counted. If people knew when they went into the polling booth their vote would count through a system of proportional representation, more people, not everyone, but more people would be likely to vote.
Hear, hear.
You don't think that a nice lamington, whatever that is, but I gather it's an Australian delicacy. Is it a cake?
It's a cake.
Yes, it's a sponge cake rolled in chocolate and then rolled in coconut.
I would vote many times to have that.
Often with the jam spread in the middle.
Oh, fantastic. Andy, why don't we have them here?
What I learned a long time ago is if you want people to attend a meeting, you put food on. If you say we're having a meeting at 7 in the morning...
Or you charge them to.
No one will come. But if you say there's a buffet on, it's really good food, they pile in and they listen. So putting food on is a really good idea. Is it good for politics? Probably not. But if you were asking me what food, I would say anything by Greggs. Have a big Greggs, mobile Greggs there, and people can choose whether they get whatever they have, the steak bake or the cheese thing or whatever. Greggs is the way forward.
A Greggs Belgian bun. That's what I would choose. Laura?
I think I'd just probably pass a tube of Pringles down the line.
Because the trouble is, if you start a tube of Pringles, you really do have to finish it, don't you? Listen, thank you all very much indeed for coming in today. We have another cross question for you tomorrow. Now, in the next hour, we are going to talk about the fact that Britain and India have signed a long-desired trade deal that ministers say will add nearly £5 billion a year to the UK economy by 2040. The agreement was finalised today after more than 3 years of negotiations under successive governments, and it's long been touted as one of the principal benefits of Brexit. Well, is it? Is that the sort of thing? If you voted for Brexit, did you vote for this sort of thing? But did you really vote for people coming to this country as a result of a trade deal and then not paying national insurance? Because that appears to be what is going to happen. Won't that just encourage British companies to employ people from India rather than people from this country? 0345 6060 973.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 9 o'clock, Indian workers and businesses won't have to pay national insurance under a free trade deal that's been agreed between the UK and India. The deal makes it cheaper for British companies to employ Indian staff. Ministers say it will be worth almost £5 billion to the economy. Tory leader Kemi Badenoch, a former business secretary, claims the agreement includes terms she couldn't sign up to.
I was the one who looked at the detail. I was the one negotiating. I did not sign this deal because I did not think